Perspective. My name is Chris. I'm a psychotherapist and consultant. Today, I'm going to discuss something. Somebody had dropped me an email, it was a while ago, and wanted to ask me about, or they asked me about dynamics at distance. So, long distance dynamics. How do they work? Can they work? All the emotions and things that are wrapped up inside of them. It's an interesting question because I've been involved in it myself with somebody thousands of miles away, and they can and they can fall apart. There's a lot, and we're going to get into all of that today. But before we go any further, as I always do, week in, week out, I want to say thank you to all of you who keep tuning in to listen, that share the show, that reach out about these questions and these conversations. I get all of your messages. I do read them. I know I'm getting a little bit behind lately in replying to everybody, but sometimes other things take precedence. I will explain at the end of the show today why in the last couple of days, a couple of things have changed for me that I have found out. So we're going to talk about that at the end. All right. If you're new here, if you're just showing up and this is the first time you're listening, welcome. And I'm glad you found your way in. If this podcast is, useful to all of you, do me a favor, consider following, rating the show on Spotify, right? If you're on the app, go click 5 stars. This allows other people to find these conversations, keeps the show growing, keeps it doing, what it's doing for everybody inside of the community, keeps it free, right? And you can also like and subscribe on YouTube. It's there. You get notified. Click the little bell. That way, when a new episode drops, you're going to get notified. And if you want to support the work I do directly here, there is a link in the show's description. That support keeps these conversations going. All right. Let's get into this today. This is a very interesting topic, something I've been involved in. I think a lot of us have been involved in. Long distance relationships tend to stir people up. Some of you hear the phrase and immediately think romance, think a lot of work, think that's not right for you, or maybe the late night calls, the countdown days, right? That airport hug that feels bigger than it probably is. Now, others hear this and think, why would you do that to yourself? Now, here's my plain position on this. It can work, and I've seen it work, right? But it's not sustained on longing at all. It's not what does it. It's sustained on structure. And most people underestimate that part. So when I say long distance, I'm not just talking about two people on opposite sides of the planet. It can be different states, different cities, right? Different time zones, military rotation. I've seen that. The common denominator here is this. You are emotionally connected, but you are not sharing daily life in a consistent way. And that matters more than most people think. Distance can intensify things. You miss each other more, you curate your time together, you avoid the same mundane friction that couples who live together deal with every day. There's no arguing about the dishes, there's no silent tension after a long work day in the same room, or who's done what chores, or who's even making dinner tonight, right? But distance also asks more of you psychologically. It asks you for emotional regulation, clarity, a whole lot of patience. And if you're in a kink dynamic, it asks for deliberate power structure when you're not physically together. So today, we're going to slow this down and look at what actually makes long distance function, where it quietly breaks down, and what question you need to be honest about if you're in one right now. All right. So why do people choose long distance? Let's slow this part down and start with this basic question. Why do people choose long distance in the first place? Because a lot of people say, you know what, there's plenty of people in the city you live in. You might live in a place like LA, New York, Tokyo, wherever, right? But you can feel lonely there. And sometimes here, it's just whole lot more simple. Career paths don't line up, right? Immigration timelines, custody agreements. One person is rooted where they are. There is, like I said, military rotation. Maybe the other person just can't rotate without blowing up their own stability. And in those cases, distance isn't romantic, it's logistical. It's two adults trying to build something without dismantling everything else they've already built. And in the lifestyle, a lot of those dynamics start online. And that's just a reality in the world we live in now. You meet in a king space, maybe a private group, a forum, right? You got Discord and Facebook and Fetlife and fetish.com and even dungeon spaces sometimes, right? Maybe you connect over some sort of philosophy or protocol, structure, roles, right? You're talking about authority and surrender before you've even asked what time zone someone lives in. So by the time geography comes up, the attachment is already forming. And let's be honest about something here. The pool can narrow. So if you're looking for a specific kind of power exchange, a certain depth of experience, or a very particular dynamic, you might not have 10 viable options in your city. You might only have one or even none. So distance becomes part of the structure almost by default. But that's only the surface layer. There's another reason distance appeals to people, and it's more psychological than that. Distance can feel safer, especially in power exchange. If you're submissive and new to surrender, distance gives you containment. You can experience intensity and controlled doses. You can step into that protocol, you can feel all the weight of it, and then you can close your laptop, return to your, physical autonomy, right? There's no one there to keep the structure going. The authority is real, but it isn't in your kitchen. It's not in your hallway or in your bathroom. So that buffer can actually lower the anxiety. And if you're a dominant, distance can also provide control over pacing. You can establish expectations gradually. You can observe consistency over time. And you're not immediately merging here all of these daily routines or tasks or negotiating some sort of cohabitation between the two of you. The dynamic has room to breathe before proximity accelerates anything. So that doesn't make it artificial, it just makes it measured. Now, psychologically, distance does something interesting here. It creates intensity without the daily friction. You don't see each other, exhausted after a long workday. You're not going to argue about the little mundane chores. You don't collide over minor irritations that come from sharing space. So your interactions are often intentional, they're definitely scheduled, and they're focused. So anticipation here builds. Visits become an event, and even a routine check in can feel significant. And in kink dynamics, rituals are deliberate. A morning instruction carries a whole lot of weight. A structured check in feels purposeful rather than automatic. So, distance amplifies the highlight reel, and that amplification can feel powerful, sometimes even cleaner than proximity. But here's where we're going to pivot. Sometimes people choose long distance consciously because it fits their life stage. It protects career momentum, it respects existing obligations, and it allows a slower build. And sometimes distance works, because closeness feels threatening. Real proximity means being seen in your ordinary state, right? It means power exchange meeting, the grocery store and the flu and that bad mood that don't resolve quickly. It means attachment without a digital buffer and no logging off, no curated windows, right? And so a lot of people here, that level of exposure is activating. Distance becomes not just practical, but it's very protective. So when we talk about long distance in a lifestyle, we're not just talking about the miles. We're talking about the pacing, the safety, the control, the desire, sometimes even avoidance. And there's a lot of people that come at me and say, well, I met somebody and things are going great. And we're building the structure and we're we live a couple states away, or they live in Canada and I'm out in Mexico or whatever. And it's not really even a relatively long distance anymore as far as flight time. But then all of a sudden they've disappeared, they've ghosted, right? That becomes the favorite term. Well, what we're not thinking about, and this is what I'm actually talking about, is that when that proximity is now going to be immediate, right? Now we're moving into avoidance. It doesn't happen in every case, and that's not what I'm saying. I'm giving you one possibility amongst the many that are out there why somebody does this. So before we decide whether all of this can work, we have to understand why it feels so compelling in the first place. So, what actually makes a long distance relationship work? So, if long distance survives, it survives on structure. We've established this, we've said this. It's not about the chemistry. It's not about the longing. It's not how intense the airport reunion's going to feel, right? It's structure. So let's start with predictability. When you're not sharing a space, uncertainty becomes a stressor, right? Would you agree with that? I'm going to assume most of you are. Probably a couple of you are going to start nodding your head. When will I hear from you? Are we okay? Did something inside of our relationship shift? If communication is random and it's inconsistent, reactive, the nervous system stays slightly activated here. So you're scanning constantly, your predictability calms, can calm all of that. A scheduled call, a defined rhythm, maybe it's, every Tuesday and Friday at 8 p.m. Maybe it's that daily check-in just before bed. The specific schedule here matters less than the consistency. Consistency tells the attachment system this is stable. So next, I'm going to move to transparency. And this becomes a big one for a lot of LDRs. Why? Because distance leaves room for the imagination. And imagination is not neutral. If ability changes and nothing is explained, the mind starts to fill the gap. If exclusivity is assumed but never discussed, resentment builds quietly. So transparency isn't romantic. It's clarifying expectations about time, your availability, other partners if that is actually relevant, travel plans, your shifts in your work schedule, right? Clear agreements reduce projection. Ambiguity feeds it. So the emotional, this is all emotional regulation coming into play. You can't escalate every insecurity into a crisis. In long distance, you don't get the benefit of a quick physical repair. You can't read the body language easily of somebody else. So tones here get misinterpreted. A delayed text can feel bigger than it actually is. So if every spike in anxiety turns into an interrogation, the relationship becomes exhausting. And emotional discipline here matters. That doesn't mean suppressing your concerns. It does mean pausing before assuming a threat. It means asking for reassurance without some sort of accusation. It means actually recognizing that your nervous system is reacting to something does not automatically mean the relationship is unstable. Visit planning is another non-negotiable. Concrete timelines reduce anxiety. Vague language increases strain, right? Something like, oh, yeah, we'll see each other soon. Now, on the interim, that sounds comforting, but actually it's destabilizing. I'll book the flight on the 15th is very stabilizing because it's concrete. Even if the visit, pardon me, is months away, having it on the calendar gives the attachment system something to hold on to. If visits are perpetually hypothetical, frustration here accumulates, right? And I want to explain something here because I want you to understand that if you've ever been in an LDR, right, especially in the digital age, this happens. 20 some years ago, I dated somebody in another country. I met them online and, everything clicked. It felt like gravity. And we were planning things. Initially, what had made me pause was this person, she had said, you know what, hey, I'll buy you a ticket. Come, I want to meet you. And I was nervous. This is never been there yet. Not that there was anything wrong with it. It was, but I was nervous. This person came on really strong as the attachment grew over months. And all we could do was talk because the internet wasn't back then. The computer systems, cameras, all of that wasn't the same back then as it is now. Things shifted. And I'm like, I want to come see you. And then everything, I can't right now. I can't right now. Right? All that anticipate, everything began to destabilize because there was nothing concrete. Right? So now let's layer in some kink here because this is going to be valuable. And this actually even ties into what I dealt with. If you are in a TPE dynamic, distance doesn't suspend the structure, it tests it. So, what are the expectations when you're apart? Is protocol active daily or only during visits? Are there rituals that maintain continuity? What, like a morning greeting? a weekly review, a task you're setting forth, right? Without intentional maintenance, power exchange becomes intermittent and it becomes a fantasy. With structure, it remains an identity-based dynamic rather than an occasional role play. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with role play, but you're not doing a power exchange if it's in a role play context. It's going to destabilize somebody. So, accountability here matters. If rules exist, are they followed? If they're broken, how is that going to be addressed? Distance magnifies drift, and clear expectations prevent it. All of this comes back to one thing: hope is not a strategy, structure is. Hope says we care about each other. Structure says, here is how that care functions in reality. Hope says, we're going to just figure this out. Structure says, this is when we will talk. This is what we expect. This is when we visit. And this is how we handle insecurity. So long distance can absolutely work, but it works because two people treat it like a system that requires maintenance, not because the feelings are strong enough to compensate for the lack of it. Now, let's get into the strain most people don't name, right? And this is the part no one wants to discuss. So you can have your structure, right? You can have those scheduled calls. You can book a flight, and you've got all your rituals in place. And strain can still show up. Not because the relationship is failing, but because distance activates things that proximity doesn't. And attachment is the first one. Distance turns up the volume on whatever your baseline is. If you lean into anxious, the gap is going to feel huge. A delayed response can land heavier than it should. Silence stretches. And if you lean avoidant, distance can feel comfortable at first because there's space, right? You have your own autonomy. But when the other person wants more closeness, the same space can start to feel like pressure. Long distance doesn't create attachment patterns, it exposes them. It removes the buffering effect of physical reassurance and asks you to rely more heavily on interpretation and trust. And then there's imagination. When you don't share daily life, you don't have full data. You don't see who they've had lunch with. You don't see their body language when they say they're tired. You don't see the ordinary details that make someone feel real and grounded. So guess what? Your brain's going to start to fill in these blanks, right? So sometimes, generously, sometimes not. Under stress, it rarely fills them kindly. It tends to make things a lot worse in your mind than what we assume. The mind looks for threat faster than it looks for stability, right? Jealousy amplifies everything here. Not always because something inappropriate is happening, but because absence leaves room for projection. You don't just miss the person, you miss context. And without context, the mind builds a narrative. And if you're already insecure, distance gives you that insecurity, a lot more room to echo. And it just, circles in your mind over and over. And idealization fits into this too. When you see someone mostly in curated windows, you see them at their best. You both prepare, you're both waiting, visits are heightened, conversations are intentional. There's anticipation before intensity and during. Now that preserves fantasy longer than daily cohabitation ever could. And this is where what we call the airport high comes in. First time visits or airport reunions feel enormous. They're emotional, they're cinematic, right? We're running to each other, our hands are in the air, and we leap and we're kissing in each other's arms, right? It's a rom com, right? You haven't seen each other in weeks or months. Your nervous system spike, but in a good way. But nobody lives in an airport. Nobody builds a lifestyle inside of that peak state. Daily reality is a lot slower. It's got boredom, it's got irritation, it's got quiet coexistence, shopping, chores, life, bills, right? Friends, family. Distance can unintentionally train couples to relate only in elevated moments. So when they're finally close the gap, the ordinariness, right, feels like loss, even though it's just normal life. There's also digital exhaustion. Maintaining intimacy through a screen takes a whole lot of effort. Constant texting, especially across time zones, checking in, monitoring tone, making sure the other person feels connected. It can become like subtle labor. The relationship starts to feel managed rather than inhabited. That doesn't mean it's unhealthy, it just means it requires energy over time. And here's the core idea that holds this section all together: distance preserves fantasy longer, proximity reveals reality faster. That isn't an argument against long distance, it's just a reminder that strain doesn't equal failure, it equals exposure. Exposure of attachment patterns, exposure of insecurity, or how much of that connection is built in peak moments versus ordinary integration. So, if you understand that strain is predictable, you're less likely to interpret it as doom. You're more likely to respond to it with maturity rather than panic. But, Chris, is there a psychological cost? Absolutely. Such a great question. Why do I do this? Because some people actually ask me this, and so I do it that way. It's a little bit for dramatic effect for you all, right? Sometimes I don't mind even talking out loud to myself. Now, this is the part that's less dramatic and more cumulative, right? The psychological cost. Not the spike of jealousy here, and not that airport high, the slow wear and tear. First is the emotional labor imbalance. In almost every long distance dynamic, one person ends up carrying more of the maintenance. One person initiates most of the calls, checks in first, or smooths the tension faster. And it's rarely malicious, it just happens that way. Over time, the imbalance creates quiet resentment. The one doing more starts to feel like they're holding a relationship together with duct tape and goodwill. The other may not even realize it's happening. Distance hides imbalance longer because there's no shared environment forcing redistribution. If you live together and one person does everything, it becomes visible really quickly. At a distance, that can just simmer on the stove. Then there are the whole time zones and energy levels. One of you is waking up motivated, and the other one's drained from a 10-hour day. One person wants to talk, and the other person just wants some silence and quiet. You miss each other emotionally. And I'm giggling there because I've been in this. I've done this. I one person I dated, long ago when you're young and you're not paying attention to the world, there's nothing wrong with it. I tell people the world is no longer a big place. It's quite small through the invention of the net. But I used to get up in the morning and this person was going to bed. So we would have an hour in between where I was getting ready for work and they were winding down their routine for the night. Right. But all of this, you can miss each other emotionally. You're just not missing the physical part of it. So you're going to start scheduling connection around fatigue instead of presence here. And it's no one's fault, but it does cost something. Over months or years, that mismatch adds a whole lot of friction. Escalation timing is another pressure point. Often one partner wants to close the gap sooner, move cities, maybe combine finances, make it concrete. And the other person wants to wait, not because they don't care, but because relocation is expensive and disruptive. It's complicated. That difference in urgency creates tension. The one ready to leap can feel stalled, and the cautious one can feel pushed. And because you don't share daily life, it's harder to assess whether you're ready for that leap in the first place. And I also want to talk about outside influences as well. When you're in an LDR with somebody, your friends and your family are definitely not going to understand why you're doing it. It can fill your head, right? They can disillusion that fantasy. Well, you don't know who that person is. They could be a serial killer. They could be a gold digger, right? They're going to tell you all sorts of things. So this fantasy you've built up in your head about this other person, this connection you have, can then get strained. And then there's the quiet erosion of intimacy. You can feel deeply connected to someone and still don't know how they move, through an ordinary Tuesday. You don't see how they handle stress in real time. You don't share small rituals like cooking together, folding the clothes, or even collapsing on the couch after work. Those micro moments build familiarity, right? Those are those little picadillos we actually fall in love with after the honeymoon phase, right? Because I hate to break it to everybody, and everybody tells me, yeah, I have sex 5 times a week, and we've got 3 kids, and everything's hunky dory. And the majority of those people who tell me that, it's not, I don't want to call you a liar, but it's just, you are an exception. You're not the rule. Because the majority of people are tired. They want to relax. And as we get older and job stress and children and kids' events and parties and sports, the community itself, right? Scheduling time becomes a thing real time, right? So I'm sorry, not everybody's doing what they're saying here. All of this, right, becomes a real thing when we're real time, but at a distance. It changes. So when we're talking about intimacy here, all of those things, when I talked to you earlier, when I said about the whole collapsing on the couch after work, without them, intimacy stays in conversation mode rather than integration. And at some point, you have to ask whether you're building a shared life or just maintaining a shared feeling. And that's the distinction most people avoid. Missing someone is not the same as building a life with somebody. Missing feels intense, it feels romantic, it even feels noble to some people, but building life is administrative, it's practical. We've got to think about budgets, compromises, who's willing to uproot and move where. And it's less cinematic and more concrete. Long distance can hold strong emotions for, a long time. But if there's no movement towards integration, that emotion can start to feel suspended in the air. You're connected, but not progressing, caring, but not consolidating. That doesn't mean that every long distance relationship must end in, relocation. Some are intentionally structured that way long term. But if neither of you can articulate how daily life eventually overlaps, that cost is going to slowly increase. And it's not always loud, it's quite subtle. And a little bit more effort, a little more negotiation, a little more wondering how long this version of the relationship can realistically be sustained. That's the psychological price, not doom, just gravity. So when it transitions, or should, at some point, every long distance relationship hits a crossroad. It might not be dramatic and it might not even be loud, but it's there. Are we closing the gap, or are we settling into this as the structure? Now, closing the gap sounds romantic when people say it. It's in practice, it's logistical spreadsheets, it's job applications, visa timelines, it's figuring out who's giving up what. Someone that usually absorbs more, right? And someone leaves their city, their routine, their support system, even when it's mutually agreed upon. That imbalance exists. Love doesn't magically erase the cost. And this is where you find out how solid the foundation really is. And I'm giggling here because I've done this. I have moved states for people. And you're living now in a space they've been in for a year, 2, 3 years, and you're disrupting their little habitat, and they don't like it. Not because they don't want you there, not because they don't love you, but you're in their ecosystem, right? Before, they could talk to you and tell you they're being all sexy in lingerie, and they're actually sitting there eating a bowl of cereal in their pajamas, right? And there's no makeup on, right? No one's got their six-pack out. They're just being real. So when we start talking about relocation forces, it forces you to get specific. Who's going to move? When? Under what types of conditions? What happens if their job doesn't transfer? What happens if the income shifts? What happens if one person struggles more than expected after the move? These are not unromantic questions, they're necessary ones. If those conversations never happen, the relationship here can start to drift. Not because there isn't care, but because there isn't a direction. You can tread water for a long time and still end up nowhere. And there's there's this whole scenario where no one moves. Sometimes both people quietly hope the other one will make the leap, and neither can do that without taking a significant financial hit. So sometimes the distance becomes by, the default because it's easier to maintain than disrupt. And before you know it, 1 to 5 years pass, the relationship is stable, but it's suspended. And at that point, you're going to have to be honest. Is this temporary distance or a permanent structure? Now, temporary distance has momentum, even if the timeline is long, right? We're going to look at a 5 year move. I've got to establish jobs. I've got to maybe apply for a visa. I've got to sell a house, right? Whatever we're doing, there's a trajectory. There's a sense that daily life will eventually overlap. Permanent structure is different. It's a conscious decision that this is how the relationship is going to function. Visits, digital intimacy, separate daily lives, clear expectations about autonomy. Now, neither option is inherently wrong, but pretending one is the other is where the problem starts. And that's where you start, you're kicking the can down the road and hoping it sorts itself out. So if you decide the distance is temporary, then it needs a plan. Even if it's a rough one, right? A moving target is still a target. But if you decide it's permanent, then you have to assess whether that version of intimacy truly satisfies both of you long term, not just emotionally, but practically. And this isn't about ultimatums, it's just about clarity. Long distance relationships don't usually implode overnight, they erode when direction stays vague, when hard conversations are postponed because they feel heavy, and when both people assume there's more time than there actually is. Because the next thing you know, you wake up, you're in an LDR that's 2, 4, 5, 6 years long. You're watching your life click by, and you're like, I want something now. Maybe I want to have kids, or I want to be married, or I want to move to Nepal. You want to start doing all these things, but your life's on hold, right? And you have to understand that friction's going to be there. Now, you can get mad at me for pointing it out, but that doesn't change the fact that the question is, and that emotion is going to sit there. And a lot of you who are in LDRs now are going to end up having a big conversation after hearing this. It's not that I'm trying to point this out to disrupt them. Again, LDRs can absolutely work. I am a living version of that. And the adjustment period was difficult, but you make it work because it had structure, it had trajectory, it had a direction and a plan. But you need to be honest about what you're doing, because otherwise you're living in ambiguity and you're going to build resentment and hurt inside of somebody else if you're not. Be clear. This is all I want. I want a computer-based relationship. That's fine. Text and FaceTime or Skyping or whatever you're doing. If that's all you want, then you just got to be clear. And if the other person doesn't, well, we're not going to get into the whole manipulating thing. That's a whole different show. Okay. But I want you to think about this. Is this distance a bridge to something shared, or is it the container you're planning on living inside? And it's a fair question, right? Look, as I wind this down today, long distance is not weak, and it's definitely not unserious. It takes special kinds of people to be inside of one. It's not automatically a placeholder, right? I've seen it work. I'm proof that it's worked. And I've seen it last. I've also seen it slowly drain people who didn't realize what it required. It is structurally demanding, and you have to be up for that. It asks for discipline in a way that proximity doesn't. So when you share a space, some connection happens by default. You bump into each other, you read a tone in real time. You might put a plate in the wrong space, or your toothbrush, faces the wrong direction, right? But repair here can be immediate. At a distance, none of that is automatic. Everything becomes intentional, matters a whole lot more. And it also, like I said to you, it exposes attachment patterns fast. So if you're prone to anxiety, you're going to feel these gaps. And if you're prone to avoidance, you might lean into the space a little too comfortably. And if you rely on intensity to reassure yourself that something is real, distance can feed that intensity while quietly avoiding, integration of any type. That doesn't make it flawed. It just makes it revealing. Long distance strips things down, right? You can't hide behind routine. You can't confuse proximity with intimacy, right? You have to ask directly for what you need. You have to tolerate uncertainty without it turning into an accusation. You have to decide whether you are in this for a feeling or for the structure. And that's where a whole lot of people stall because feelings are powerful, but missing someone, it just, it feels massive. Reunions, they're glorious. We're running in slow motion towards each other. The world around us is quiet, right? Late night conversations, they feel intimate and shared, and they know my soul. But power and intimacy are not the same thing as sustainability. And at some point, every long distance dynamic confronts the same quiet reality. Is this moving somewhere, or are we circling in a very meaningful holding pattern? Now, there's nothing wrong with choosing distance long term if both people understand just what it is. And there's nothing wrong with slow timelines if there's actual movement. The problem is not the distance, the problem is vagueness. When there is clarity, people can endure a lot. When there is direction, sacrifice can make sense. And when there's a shared understanding, those miles don't automatically erode the bond. But when there's ambiguity, when nobody names what this is becoming, strain accumulates quickly and quietly. So I'm going to leave you with a question to reflect on. If you are in a long distance relationship, are you building towards something concrete, or are you maintaining something that feels intense but undefined? And I know asking this question, for those of you who are in LDRs, are going to reach out and either tell me, because I've talked about this before. I did a workshop on it, and I got a mix. I don't know, roughly, I don't know, about 60-40. And the 60% was, thank you, you just imploded my relationship. I didn't implode anything. You were avoiding the things that were there. And I just exposed the question didn't want to talk about. And that's not my fault. That's just the reality of people, right? My question here is it's not a challenge. It's just an invitation for people to be honest. And if you're not going to be honest, this question is going to expose it. That's not on me. That's on what somebody may be not willing to confront inside of their relationship. Okay. I want to get to a couple of other things regarding some social media. It's not about a whole you're famous now. So I have noticed engagement was down over this past week. I had no idea that something on Fetlife had changed. All of a sudden, I thought I was shadow banned. I reached out. I spoke to the site owner, John Baku, who I've had on the show. And we had a very, very, straightforward conversation. Bottom line, they've changed their algorithm. So unless I make some changes on how I write and what I say, not in my content, what I'm writing to you all or what I'm discussing, but something I put at the bottom, which is my footer, and I'm going to explain that in a moment. My exposure and my reach is going to be dramatically cut. That's just the reality of it. So why is all of that important? So I want to be very clear. I write, I provide free worksheets. I do all of my speaking engagements right now. No one pays me for them. They're my time, and I answer questions, and my show, and a few other things that don't even touch my practice. All of this that I do for everybody is supported by my practice. Right now, I'm independent. I work by myself. I don't have colleagues. I'm not part of a big clinic because I don't want to be. So for me, when I put that footer in at the bottom, if you've ever seen my writings, it just said, where you can follow me. It talks about my show. If you want to work with me, all of that is now has to disappear, or no one is going to see any more of the work I do. It's going to be very restricted. So I've had to make a choice. Now I've rewritten things, and I'm voicing this because somebody gave me advice and not to say anything, but I'm a little kind of upset by it. All this stuff that I do for the community, it's still got to be, it's time and it's got to be paid for. So if I don't have a way to connect and maybe draw in clientele that keeps supporting this, I can't do it. When I tell you all there's a link in my show, if you want to donate, there are no expectations. I'm not asking for that like other people who've got thrown accounts and ask for some of the most ridiculous things. And I'm actually probably going to do a writing on that because I find that very humorous. But I'm not going to get into that right now. So you're going to see my writing style change and my footer change specifically because now I have to worry about avoiding a new algorithm on social media so 50 people don't see of the almost 12,000 that follow me and no one's finding my work because, a couple people, 20 people complained on Fetlife who don't pay for the website at all, right? And they're changing the algorithm and it's kind of aggravating for me. But whatever, it is what it is. I don't own the website, but I will abide by it. So I just want to let you all know that you'll see a little bit of a writing style change for me and how I word things at the end. Some of my things are still clear in my policy on when you engage and so on and so forth. All right, that's out of the way. I had to say that. Yes, I'm still working on my book. No, I'm in brainstorm right now. I'm sketching everything out. I've got about 12 working titles, so no, I don't have a title yet. Somebody asked me this. Um, and I don't. Somebody else asked me about something because I let it slip and I shouldn't have. I actually have another book that I wrote. It has nothing to do with the lifestyle. It's more based on some other work I used to do. I'm actually drafting that one first. It's going to be, I don't know, somewhere between 400 and 600 pages, but that's a different type of novel. I might tell you all about it, but it's nothing to do with BDSM. It's more about spying and terrorism. It was a different part of my life a long time ago, right? A lot of you don't know that, but I was involved in counterterrorism work a long time ago. But I'm going to finish that one first, and that's going to take me about 6 months. And I already have that mostly done. I've just got to go through and refine it, and then I've got to edit it, and then I've got to figure out about publication and stuff. Anyway, with all that being said, to the rest of your questions that you send in, I try to get to them as fast as I can. The one question I've gotten 3 times in the last 2 weeks, can I explain why, again, I do respond on AMAs or certain emails? This enters into therapeutic territory and I can't unpack it reasonably. What does that mean? That means you are asking me a question that is a therapy-based question. And I am, first off, ethically, I can't answer it, right? And second, that's exactly the work I get paid to do, right? Is help people sort through all of these things. So I can't honestly answer your question, right? And quite honestly, I'm not going to. I don't know how else to say this without, I'm not gatekeeping information, but I mean, I've studied to do all of this and this is my profession. So you're asking me stuff inside of my profession. I can't answer it. That's why I don't. It's not to be rude and it's not to be dismissive. I just can't answer your question, right? Finally, expectations. So a lot, there's been a little bit of strain on for me. I've slowed down in responding to a couple of things because I'm busy. If I tell you I'm going to get to your writing or you send me an email and I say, yep, I'm going to think about it, please understand that when I'm not doing social media or the show, that I'm working with people. Every day I work from 5 a.m. to 8 a.m. doing group therapy with veterans. After that, then I'm doing my practice. So I've got other stuff to do than worry about a question on social media. That is not to be dismissive. That is just reality. And I would like you all to understand that, not because I don't hear you. And if you ask me something that's really interesting, I'm probably going to get to it, but I need time to think about it. I need to have 20 minutes in a day to sit down and give your question or comment some proper thought. And then I'm going to respond or I'll build an article or build a show around it like this show today, right? Because I'm doing this for somebody. Anyways, it's kind of enough. I know that sounded like a mini rant, but I think I wanted to clarify a few things. Interviews. I am going to work on getting Hi There Catsuit. There's a couple of other things I'm starting to see. Do I want to jump into politics? I'm kind of getting edged towards that way. I read again yesterday about the whole I don't believe certain people should be inside of the kink community. Well, there's no one that's an arbiter of kink. If you own your own dungeon and you don't want certain people there, that's fine. It's private. It's a private social club, right? That's usually how they're classified. And you can absolutely restrict anybody. But to say nobody can be a part of the kink community, nobody can be on Fetlife, nobody can be on fetish.com, Facebook, Discord groups, you don't get that right. And I'm very willing to have anybody on who wants to debate this. If you want to debate this very logically, I'm very happy to do that. I'm very well versed in a lot of things. I have my own views. I tend not to share them, but this year I'm more willing to get into some of these bigger conversations. Yep, I know it's risky territory, but I'm interested. I do want to get into race play, right? I understand the debate around it, but I think it's limited. If you want my honest opinion, two people, the majority of the argument centers around two races, right? You can't do that because there's quite a lot of races on the planet and different cultures. So you can't say that somebody who is a dominatrix out of India who only wants to date a Venezuelan guy and make him, submit, and that's all she's going to date. She can't do that because she's choosing a race. But then the argument I've heard back on that one was, well, yeah, but it's not around just black and white. Well, I hate to tell you, there are more races in the world than the black culture and the white culture. And by the way, those cultures are extremely diverse, right? Because what are you actually talking about? European Caucasian, Central Nordic Caucasian, Eastern European Caucasian? Are you talking about Central, North, South, North African Black? What are we talking about, right? So you can't just center these conversations on two things. Because I've met a couple that Japanese guy who would only date specifically women from one country. That's it. Search was extremely limited. But why is his decision as an Asian man not allowed? So I'm willing. If you all want to get into this debate, we can. And I've talked to a friend of mine who happens to be a bull in the Netherlands, and we've talked about this at length. And he's like, I enjoy doing it, and no one's going to tell me. I agree. It tends to be a lot of Americans that tend to say this more so than the rest of the planet, because I see integration in places like the UK, which are, quite biracially diverse. I think it's wonderful, but you can't start dictating that they can't do that, or that attraction can't exist, or that preference, right? So if you want to get into that, we can. Religious play is another one. I'm a little bit more heated on this one, actually. I'm a Reformed Catholic, but there's still a lot of stuff I can't do. I know there's a lot of people that can't, who are heavily into it. There are people that here we get into the God thing, and I've talked to them, work with them privately on that. And I can have really in-depth conversations, right? Because it's a big thing. Spirituality comes in a lot of forms, right? There's a lot of religions out there. But what happens if we take that into as far as the BDSM and kink scene, right? We tend to lean more into the Christianity. What happens now when we lean into like Hindu or Buddhist representations? What about Muslim? I'm willing to talk about that if you all want to join in. If not, these are going to be conversations that are going to come in that are going to be a little bit more one-sided. So if you want to, reach out to me, right? The kink perspective at gmail.com. Let me know. I'm willing to discuss it, right? We can schedule something. All right, guys. I'm going to give you my question again, like I always do, because I know that was a long little bit of rant, and the show went way longer than I expected today, but that's all right. Gives you guys some extra context for the day. So here's the question from today's show. If you are in a long-distance relationship, are you building towards something concrete, or are you maintaining something that feels intense but undefined? Let me know in the comments section. Let's talk about this. Again, I want to see some responses. I love it. You guys are starting to respond more. This is a bigger topic. At some point, I'm going to imagine a few of you have been in this, who've listened, right? Let's talk about this. Let's hear and get some of these comments going. Until next time, everybody, be safe, stay kinky.